The Anarchy was a civil war in England and Normandy between the forces of Empress Matilda and King Stephen over the throne of England. After the war's conclusion, peace was somewhat restored and the succession was agreed upon. Empress Matilda's son Henry would succeed King Stephen, but what happened to the historical figures who fought in the Civil War? Let's start with the man who started it all, King Stephen. By the end of the war, King Stephen could be described as a broken man. His wife, who he owed everything to, had died in 1152. His son and heir Eustace had died just a few weeks after the Treaty of Wallingford. King Stephen did have another son, but he would never rise to be a rival for Henry over the crown, as the Treaty of Winchester stated that King Stephen would adopt Henry as his lawful son and heir, but Stephen would still be king. The first part of the peace agreement that was enacted was the destruction of several castles and counter-castles built during the Civil War. King Stephen did destroy a few, while some were just abandoned. The king ordered that new coinage be made in order to show a return to normality and to state his royal authority was set and that he was the king. Another act the king took to restore royal authority was to hold a large gathering in the north of England at the city of York. But by 1154, King Stephen's health began to fail him, and he died on the 25th of October 1154. His death brought an end to the Norman kings of England and the rise of the Plantagenet dynasty. Empress Matilda. She had been living in Normandy since 1148 and was busy handling the day-to-day administration there. She also had the difficult task of keeping the Norman nobles in line, and of course the French king was still looking for a way to get back at Henry over his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, so Empress Matilda had to be vigilant. Her remaining years, she acted as an advisor to her son, the now King Henry of England. She attended most of the important council meetings and held a great deal of influence over the court and Henry. One example of her influence was during a meeting in 1155. Henry wanted to invade Ireland, but the plan never materialised as Empress Matilda disapproved over such a costly and time-consuming campaign. The Empress had also been a patron of two monks of Bec. Empress Matilda had always been a spiritual lady. Of course, it's given that most people in Western Europe were religious. The nobility expressed their devotion with sponsors and grand building projects. She supported many religious orders. In her later life, however, Empress Matilda experienced tragedy, as two of her sons died, yet she got to enjoy having many grandchildren. One pivotal moment in English history Empress Matilda was a part of was the election of a new Archbishop of Canterbury. King Henry did have influence over the choice, and he chose a close friend, Thomas Becket. Empress Matilda greatly disapproved of Becket being Archbishop, but her influence could only go so far, and Becket was selected. Of course, when the disputes between Henry and Becket began, Thomas wrote to the Empress, writing, "You ought, if you please, employ the diligence of a mother and the authority of a lady to recall him to duty. You, who acquired the kingdom and the duchy for him with much effort and transmitted hereditary rights to him in succession." Becket is saying that Henry isn't playing fair, and that the Empress, as a good woman, should sort Henry out. But how Empress Matilda retorts back in a letter truly shows her characteristic and personality off. She writes, "To Thomas, Archbishop of Canterbury, Empress Matilda, the Lord Pope charged and enjoined me for the remissions of my sins to intervene to re-establish peace between my son, the King, and you, and attempt to reconcile you with him. Then, as you know you also asked me, wherefore with greater dedication, as much for the honour of God as for the honour of the Holy Church. I took pains to begin and manage the matter, but it seemed very grace to the king and his barons and council, since he asserts that though he loved and honoured you and made you lord of his whole kingdom and all his lands, and raised you greater honour than anyone in his lands, so that he should believe more securely in you than in any other. You disturbed his whole kingdom against him as much as you could, so that little was left for you to do but to disinherit him by force. One thing more I tell you truly, that you cannot recover the grace of the king except by great humility and most evident moderation." This is a brilliant letter from Empress Matilda. Not only is she telling Becket off for his own presumptuous behaviour, but she is reminding him of where all his good graces have come from, as she was opposed to him being elected to the position in the first place. This was a woman who Becket didn't want to mess with, as she was firmly on Henry's side in the matter. Becket never responded back to her. One of Empress Matilda's last acts was to mediate between the King of the Franks and the King of England over territories, and again in the letter to the French king, she's straight to the point and blunt. She writes, "To Louis, by grace of God, excellent King of the Franks, and her natural lord, Matilda, Empress and daughter of a king, greetings and loyal service with love. May your excellency recall that I have often asked you about the quarrel between you and my son, the King of England, but you have made no response which satisfies or informs me. Therefore I am sending Remigus of St. Valery to implore your highness. Do not delay. If it pleases you, send me the details about the quarrel, for unless you do, such may happen between you that I will not be able to amend." Quite a letter reading this for the first time, as it made me think of an angry teacher scolding a pupil. Empress Matilda showing her no-mess approach, and the matter was soon sorted thanks to her. By this time, Empress Matilda's health was failing, and she died on the 10th of September 1167 at the age of 65. She was buried at the abbey in Bec. An epitaph on her tomb reads, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies the daughter, wife and mother of Henry." Henry Plantagenet. Because his reign started not long after the war, I will do a whole video on him one day in the future. Ranulf de Gernan. Ranulf's part in the Anarchy had been, as with most nobles, looking after his lands and expanding his own power, and he did this somewhat. Despite being imprisoned by King Stephen and losing a good chunk of his lands, Ranulf was still a powerful noble. Gervase of Canterbury describes Ranulf's actions. He did little for the Duke unless it fitted with his own designs. He is referring to Ranulf's receiving the honour of Lancaster. Ranulf had made his peace with the King of the Scots David over the lands in Carlisle. The young King Henry would have to watch his back, as Ranulf had shown he was quite willing to swap sides if he sensed opportunity. But Ranulf had little chance to betray the future king, as in December of 1153 Ranulf was enjoying a feast at William Peverell the younger's estate when he was poisoned. Ranulf did not die shortly after, but suffered a long and painful death. William of Ypres was King Stephen's right-hand man. He had been with him for most of the campaigns, the Battle of Lincoln, the Siege of Oxford, etc. King Stephen had rewarded him well with vast estates in Kent, but as William was a mercenary and a foreigner, he wasn't popular with the nobility, and by the late 1140s he was completely blind, meaning he was now of little use to King Stephen, and by the time Henry became king, he would have little favour for the man who fought his mother all throughout the Civil War. William gave up his lands in Kent as he had no friends at the English court and left for Loo in Flanders, where he died sometime around the 1160s. Bishop Henry of Winchester. Henry had been instrumental in the peace treaty that ended the Civil War and set out the terms of the Treaty of Winchester, along with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobold of Bec. Henry had also been a powerful player during the Anarchy, but after the war he faded into the background, only appearing when important matters arose, such as the constitutions of Clarendon, which saw King Henry try to curb church authority in England. Bishop Henry was also one of Thomas Becket's biggest patrons, and even after Becket's murder, Bishop Henry continued to support his family. In August of 1171, Bishop Henry died. We think he's buried in Winchester Cathedral, but the sources conflict each other, as one states William II is buried in the sarcophagus. John Fitzgilbert, or John Marshall, was a powerful noble during the Anarchy, but he's overshadowed by his more famous son, William Marshall. John initially supported King Stephen, but after the Battle of Lincoln, like a few nobles, he switched sides, but never rejoined the king's company. After the war, we hear very little from John. He may have been content with his holdings under King Henry, but I don't have a lot of information on John after the war. He died in 1165, and his title of Marshal would later be claimed by his son, the legendary knight William Marshall. Theobold of Bec, Archbishop of Canterbury. Theobold was an important figure in ending the Anarchy, as he and Henry of Winchester worked together to ratify the Treaty of Wallingford-Winchester shortly after the war. Theobold began to receive praise for his acts in ending the war. Osbert of Clare wrote a letter to Theobold, praising him for helping end the civil war. One part of the letter says the following: "You have restored order to our distracted country." When King Stephen died, Henry was in Normandy and didn't arrive in England for 6 weeks. Theobold acted as regent. After the crowning, Theobold carried on with church matters as well as the education and sponsorship of several young men, including Thomas Becket, his eventual successor. So with that, my series on the Anarchy is finished. Some figures I didn't mention had already died shortly before the end of the war, like King David of Scotland and his heir Henry. But I'll be making a full documentary on King David and how he transformed Scotland in the future. Thank you for watching.